ladies. We have a caller, so let me see who this is, because it might be Publius. Let's say hello. Hello.
This is Publius.
Hey,
hi.
This is Publius.
Hi, Publius. How are you?
Welcome.
I'm doing well.
It was so good to meet you last weekend.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for your listeners, Barbara and I were at the 10th Amendment Center's Nullify Now rally in Raleigh last Saturday. Well, it was Saturday, October the 19th. It was a great event.
Yes.
And I got to meet Barbara.
Yay!
It was wonderful.
It was. And also, I learned so much that day. And that's why I had asked you to come on for us, because there's so many people just don't understand what it means. They think, we're lying about this information about nullifying, as well as, they thought we were lying also about the bottom line on Obamacare, and they thought we were lying about Benghazi, and they thought we were lying about everything. But the truth is coming out. So I would love for you to explain a little bit about the nullification. We do know that it's out of attention.
Sure. I'll give a brief overview of nullification, and I'll also give the link to my website where I have proof of everything I'm going to tell you tonight. I wrote a paper entitled James Madison Rebukes Nullification Deniers. It's at my website, and in that paper I quote our founding fathers, our framers, and I provide hyperlinks to original articles that they wrote which prove that they supported nullification. Okay, let me give a brief overview for your listeners.
Thank you.
Nullification is real simple. It is the refusal to submit to unconstitutional acts of a government. Now, we, the people, created the federal government when we ratified the Constitution. So the federal government is our creature. Mm-hmm. That is how Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson referred to the federal government as our creature. Since we, the people, created the federal government, we have the right to tell it what we are allowing it to do. And that is what we did in the Constitution, where we listed, enumerated all the powers we delegated to the federal government. Basically, all we authorized the federal government to do for the country at large falls into 4 categories. 1, military defense, international commerce and relations. 2, control immigration and naturalization of new citizens. 3, domestically to create a uniform commercial system, weights and measures, patents and copyrights, money based on gold and silver, bankruptcy laws, mail delivery, and some road building. And 4, with some of the amendments, secure certain civil rights. That's basically it. All other powers are reserved by the states or the people. That's what the 10th Amendment confirms. Now, Article 1, Section 8, Clauses 1 through 16 of the Constitution is where most of the powers delegated to the federal government for the country at large are listed. So, when you want to know whether something the federal government does is constitutional, look at the Constitution. Is what the federal government did specifically authorized by the Constitution? If yes, then the act is probably constitutional and you can't nullify it. But if not, then the act is unconstitutional. Is control of the medical care of the people on the list, girls?
No, ma'am.
No, it isn't. No, it isn't. So, what can we, the people, the creators of the federal government, do when our creature does things we never gave it permission to do? Our framers, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, all said we have the natural right to nullify such acts. Well, how do we go about nullifying unconstitutional laws?
Wait, can I ask a question?
Sometimes, yeah.
Okay, when we send our representatives and our senators up there to represent us, and they pass the unconstitutional law representing us, does that still okay to nullify? Did that make
of course. Yeah, it's acts of Congress, executive orders of the president, rules made by the executive agencies, and even Supreme Court opinions.
Okay.
All of them. When they're unconstitutional, we have the natural right to refuse to obey. This is one of our founding principles. Remember, in the Declaration of Independence, it states in the second paragraph that when governments become obstructive of the purposes for which they are created, then the people have the right, the duty to overthrow such governments. So that's where the natural right of nullification comes from. It's the natural right of self-defense from a tyrannical government. And all of our framers recognize this natural right. So when Congress passes an unconstitutional law, or the President issues an unconstitutional executive order, or the Supreme Court issues an unconstitutional opinion, sometimes the appropriate course of action for us is refuse to obey it. Other times, as with the federal fugitive slave laws, we must obstruct and impede enforcement of unconstitutional laws. Now, here I'll give you an example of nullification by refusal to obey.
Okay.
Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King nullified the state Jim Crow laws. These required black people to sit at the back of the bus. They couldn't eat in public restaurants, use public restrooms, water fountains, park benches. Using non-violent civil disobedience, Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King led black people to refuse to obey these laws, which were unconstitutional under Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. This is how brave citizens nullify unconstitutional laws. They say, we won't comply. Now, isn't that a great example?
It
That
really
is a great
is.
example. But can I ask this question? Like,
sure.
From the state legislature, should they actually put in a bill to say that we are not going to comply with this law because it's unconstitutional? Like, should we have our state government do that?
I recommend that when states are exercising their natural right of self-defense to nullify unconstitutional acts of the federal government, I suggest that the states pass nullification resolutions explaining why they have determined that the federal act is unconstitutional and setting forth their intention not to comply. And the purpose of this is to inform everybody in their state, hey, we're not going to comply with this federal law in this state, and also to educate the general public. For example, with respect to Obamacare, I have prepared some model nullification resolutions which states could use, which explain why Obamacare is unconstitutional, and informing the world we're not going to comply with it. And it's on my website.
Okay. Oh, so, it is. Because I have your website up because I always refer back to it when somebody tells me something stupid. I know that you have the answer here and exactly where to go.
We know the expert.
Yes. And also I have an Ask Questions page on my website. So if you can't find a paper on it, you can just post a question on the Ask Questions page and I'll answer it. Now, here is another example of an unconstitutional act of the Supreme Court which really sticks in my craw. This is where states should have nullified a series of unconstitutional decisions of the Supreme Court. Prayer in the public school.
Mm-hmm.
The Constitution does not delegate to the federal government power to ban Christianity. But in 1962, the Supreme Court started ordering the states to stop the praying and remove the Ten Commandments. Those Supreme Court orders were usurpations of powers not lawfully possessed by the federal government, so the states should have nullified them by directing their schools to ignore them.
But with that, then you have the atheists going and suing the state. So if the state just says, okay, we'll be done with it, then that cost for going to court and being sued, the state doesn't have to deal with.
I think that the proper, first of all, our framers never told us to let the federal courts decide constitutional issues. Never, never, never.
Right.
And I have read every word in the Federalist Papers. Our framers repeatedly told us that we have the right to decide. We must not permit the federal government to usurp powers. We must understand that if we're not careful, the Supreme Court will connive with the other branches of the federal government to usurp powers over us. James Madison specifically said, and I proved this in my written paper by hyperlinks to James Madison's original writings. James Madison said that we have the right to judge the acts of the Supreme Court to the same extent as we have the right to judge acts of Congress and the executive branch. So the proper course of action for states to do if somebody files a lawsuit in federal court to argue that the states have to stop the praying is to ignore it. I would refuse to recognize the jurisdiction of the federal courts over this issue. Sometimes you have to man up.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that brings up a really good point, because the problem is it's less of a problem what the administration has done at each point, whether we're talking about Obamacare, whether we're talking about NDAA, and any of the various scandals from the IRS to the NSA spying.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody is having the cojones and the spine to stand up and hold them accountable, and don't let them just, you know, I mean, when I see the hearings and stuff, it just drives me up the wall because they kiss each other's butts, and they don't ask any hard questions, and they don't hold anybody accountable. We don't have a real opposition party to hold these things, to hold these anti-constitutional acts, to hold these acts of tyranny, to, you know, hold the perpetrators to account.
I know. As a people, we have lost our courage. The people we elect to high office are spineless.
Well, also from what I understand, Publius, is that in colleges they don't teach the Federalist Papers any longer.
Oh, no. I was in law school. I've been a lawyer about 40 years. I do not recall the Federalist Papers ever being mentioned when I was in law school, and I would have noticed if they had been mentioned because I had already read them and was familiar with them by the time I started law school, but I never heard them mentioned. And here's another thing. I have never met a lawyer who actually read the federal Constitution in law school. We certainly didn't read it in law school. Instead, what we read were U.S. Supreme Court opinions which purported to show why the federal government has the power to do basically anything they want.
Wow.
And that is what is produced by the law schools. Generations of lawyers whose minds have been stamped with authoritarian dogma from law school. They can't think. They don't know any of our founding principles. They've just been indoctrinated with authoritarianism. They believe that the Supreme Court is God. The Constitution means whatever the Supreme Court says it means, and our job as lawyers is to obey the Supreme Court. And that's what they tell all the people. That's what all the nullification deniers are telling everybody, that only the Supreme Court can decide if an act of the federal government is unconstitutional. Here's another scenario which is likely to come up where we absolutely must refuse to comply, disarming the American people.
Yep.
If Congress by law or the President by executive order or the BATF by rule or the Supreme Court by opinion or the federal government by UN treaty orders the people to turn in our arms, we must refuse to comply. The Constitution doesn't authorize the federal government to disarm us. So the states and the people must nullify such law or order or rule or opinion or treaty by refusing to obey. All nullification requires is a spine.
Yep.
Wow.
Now here is the controversial question. Who decides whether the acts of the federal government are unconstitutional? Our framers said the states or the people decide. Jefferson and Madison said that since the federal government is merely the creature of the compact the states made with each other, there can be no authority higher than the states to decide whether their creature has violated the compact, the Constitution. For example, if you have an employee and you've got rules for your business, and your employee violates the rules, do you decide if the employee violated the rule, or do you ask the employee to decide, did you violate the rule? It's ridiculous to let the employee decide. Well, the federal government is our creature. We don't let it decide. We are the creators. We decide. That's exactly what Alexander Hamilton said. We the people decide. And Madison was emphatic that the states have as much right to judge the acts of the Supreme Court as they do the acts of the legislative and executive branches of the federal government. But the nullification deniers, and they're led by law professor Randy Barnett, everyone apparently at Heritage Foundation, David Barton at Wall Builders, Mark Levin, insist that only the Supreme Court decides whether acts of the federal government are unconstitutional. Now, think about what they are really saying. Remember, we created the Supreme Court when we ratified the Constitution.
Right.
So, does the creature dictate to the creator? The nullification deniers say yes. They say every law made by Congress, that's the legislative branch of the federal government, is supreme. And every executive order issued by the president, and every word in the Code of Federal Regulations, that's the executive branch of the federal government, is binding. And the states and the people must obey unless and until 5 judges on the Supreme Court, that's the judicial branch of the federal government, say the law or executive order or agency rule is unconstitutional. In other words, only the federal government may question the federal government, but no one may question the Supreme Court. They insist that the federal government created by the Constitution is the exclusive and final judge of the extent of its powers. And 5 judges, that's the sole measure of the powers of the federal government. Now, I submit to you that that position is, on its face, absurd.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, we do. This government that we have now is getting so tyrannical that they even. I mean, this is my thing, and it's not been proven as a fact yet. It's just my instinct is that Judge Roberts had something holding over his head where he said it's a tax. But under the law of the Constitution, the House starts the tax, not the judges.
Well, that's true. All bills for raising revenue must originate in the House. That's Article 1, Section 7, Clause 1 of the Constitution says that all bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House. But there's a larger reason for saying that Obamacare is unconstitutional, and it is this. The Constitution, we never delegated to the federal government power to control our medical care.
Right. Jude had mentioned earlier that if we allow this to happen, that it would enslave us, basically. It would bring us back to slavery.
Oh, yes. Yes, well, the welfare state, the socialist welfare state that we have now is slavery because basically the money can be taken from you by force and redistributed to other people. So your God-given property rights have been taken away from you. So yes, you are working in order to pay other people's living expenses.
Right.
And it's against your will. So yes, that is slavery.
Yes.
And Justice Roberts is a disgrace to the bench.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because they're not allowed to legislate from the judicial branch, and that's what they did, pretty much, when he called it a tax.
Yes. But
the
even
other point
about calling it a tax, remember Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 does delegate to Congress the authority to impose taxes. However, Congress can only tax in order to raise revenues to carry out its enumerated powers. For example, Congress can levy taxes in order to provide and maintain a navy. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 13. They can tax in order to operate the Patent and Copyright Office. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8. In other words, they can only tax in order to raise funds to support its enumerated powers. They cannot lawfully impose a tax for whatever reason they want. There are a great many reasons why Obamacare is unconstitutional, and if we were a manly people, every state would nullify it.
And do you think some of this, though, is like ignorance, like because they don't teach the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, that even at our state level, the legislators don't understand the power the state has?
Right. I have found that as a general principle, state legislators are profoundly ignorant of our founding principles, and some of them are lawyers who were indoctrinated in law school. In Tennessee, we have a state senator, Senator Brian Kelsey, from the general area of Memphis, Tennessee, who has been completely indoctrinated by Randy Barnett. And so Senator Kelsey thinks that it doesn't matter what the federal government does, unless the Supreme Court says it's unconstitutional, everybody has to obey. Well, he was indoctrinated by Randy Barnett.
Wow.
So Jefferson and Madison said that without nullification, the states and the people would be under the absolute and unlimited control of the federal government. And that is where these nullification deniers would put us all. And our masters would be 5 judges on the Supreme Court. Elena Kagan, Sonia Sotomayor, you get the idea?
Yeah.
Who wants those women running our lives?
Oh, not I.
No,
right.
And that's the other thing, too, because most of us know that Obama really wants, I think this is all his plan, for it to be this screwy, to go to a one-payer, because that's what he wants. And that's going to be worse than what we got. So, I think we all really need to send the Federalist Papers and your articles to all of our senators and representatives to say, hey, this is a problem.
The problem is that Americans have been so dumbed down, they can't understand the Federalist Papers. When they were written, literacy in this country was pretty high.
Right.
The Federalist Papers were published in several newspapers, but today the American people can't read them.